Welcome to Socialist Action Webcast. This is webcast number 3 in the spring 2023 series. My name is Elizabeth Bice. I'm the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action, a member of the NDP Socialist Caucus Steering Committee, a past Secretary of Toronto New York Region Labour Council, and a retired member of Canadian Union of Postal Workers. We acknowledge that this event is taking place on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island, known as North America. That includes the unceded territories of the Mississauga of the New Credit, the Wendat, and Haudenosaunee people in a place called Toronto. Today, I'm speaking to you from Jamaica, where the Indigenous Taino and Arawak-speaking people began arriving here 4,000 years ago. They were wiped out by European colonial powers. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's topic is the Communist Manifesto, an introduction, featuring Barry Weisletter, the Federal Secretary of Socialist Action. He is based in Toronto. This webcast will examine the manifesto 175 years after its publication. What is the contemporary relevance of this iconic document? For about 45 minutes, Barry will summarize the main elements of the famous text and then answer questions. So let's welcome our speaker. Barry is a union organizer, writer, editor, teacher, and a federal secretary of Socialist Action. He is the chair of the NDP Socialist Caucus. He has been a delegate to almost every federal and Ontario NDP convention since 1971. And has frequently been a delegate to the Ontario NDP Provincial Council. Elected as the Thornhill Ontario NDP candidate in September 2011, his nomination was undemocratically rescinded. His speech at Vancouver in June 2011, "Socialism is a rocket," ably defended the S word, the very bad S word, in the NDP federal constitution. For 20 years, Barry was president of the Toronto Substitute Teachers, was elected 3 times to the Ontario Public Service Employees Union Executive Board, and subsequently to the Provincial Council of the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation. He is a leading member of the Cross Country Workers Action Movement and of the Municipal Social Alliance in Ontario. Welcome, Barry.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and good evening, comrades and friends. 2023 marks the 175th anniversary of the Communist Manifesto. It is an historical document, both a product of its time and one that is still relevant to ours. The Communist Manifesto, originally the Manifesto of the Communist Party, is a political pamphlet written by German revolutionary socialists Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Commissioned by the Communist League and originally published in London in February 1848, the Manifesto remains one of the world's most influential political documents. It presents an analytical approach to class struggle and criticizes capitalism and the capitalist mode of production without attempting to provide a blueprint for the form that communism would take in the future. How has the Communist Manifesto stood the test of time? Well, with the aid of an article by Leon Trotsky written on the 90th anniversary of the Communist Manifesto, let's do a quick review of its main points. 1. The materialist conception of history discovered by Marx and applied skillfully in the Manifesto remains indispensable. All other interpretations of the historical process lack scientific meaning. 2. The first chapter of the Manifesto begins with, and I quote, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles." Quote. It is precisely the epoch of imperialism, bringing all social contradictions to a peak, which confirms the theory behind the Communist Manifesto. 3. The anatomy of capitalism as a specific stage in the economic development of society was fully presented by Marx in Capital, published in 1867. But even in the Communist Manifesto of 1848, the main lines of the future analysis, Marx and Engels, are firmly sketched out. Pay for labor value is equivalent to the cost of its reproduction. Surplus value is appropriated by the capitalists. Competition is the basic law of social relations. The intermediate classes are being ruined, that is, the urban petty bourgeoisie and the peasantry. Wealth is concentrated in the hands of an ever diminishing number of property owners, while the working class grows ever larger. Capitalist development prepares the material and political preconditions for a socialist society. The fourth element. The proposition in the manifesto concerning the tendency of capitalism to lower living standards of the workers on a world scale is borne out by the current global capitalist crisis, by the situation in the less developed countries, by massive forced migration, to say nothing of what is happening in the former worker states of Eastern Europe and Russia, and in the heavily deformed worker states of China and Vietnam. 5. In opposition to the manifesto, which depicted commercial and industrial crises as a series of ever more extensive catastrophes, liberals and social democrats predicted that the national and international development of giant monopolies and oligopolies would guarantee their control over the market and lead gradually to the abolition of crises. Again, present reality shows that the truth proved to be on the side of Marx. Crises are more widespread and more violent than ever. 6. Quote, "The executive of the modern state is but a committee for the managing of the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie." Quote. This is the only scientific theory of the state. Bourgeois democracy can serve ultimately only the bourgeoisie. A government of capitalist parties or a coalition government of capitalist and workers' parties is still only, quote, "a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie." Quote. Whenever this governing committee manages affairs poorly, the bourgeoisie dismisses it with a boot. I guess Trump is an example of that. Harper was too. Number 7, quote, "Every class struggle is a political struggle. The organization of the proletariat as a class, consequently, its organization into a political party," close quote. Union bureaucrats on the one hand and anarcho-syndicalists on the other hand have long tried to ignore these historical laws. Pure trade unionism has been dealt a crushing blow in its chief refuge, the United States. Anarcho-syndicalism suffered an irreparable defeat in its last stronghold, Spain, in 1937. Here too, the manifesto proved to be quite correct. Number 8, the proletariat cannot conquer power within the legal framework established by the bourgeoisie. Communists openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. That was a quote from the manifesto. Reformism sought to explain this point of the manifesto by pointing to the immaturity of the movement at the time and the inadequate development of democracy. Well, the fate of Italy and Germany in the 1920s and 30s, and Chile in 1973, and a great number of other democracies proves that, quote, immaturity is the distinguishing feature of the ideas of the reformists themselves. Number 9, for the socialist transformation of society, the working class must concentrate in its hands such power as can smash each and every political obstacle barring the road to the new system. Quote, "The proletariat organized as the ruling class." Quote, "This is the dictatorship of the proletariat." At the same time, it is the only true form of democracy, democracy of the vast majority. Its scope and depth depend upon concrete historical conditions. The greater the number of states that take the path of the socialist revolution, the freer and more flexible forms the dictatorship will assume, and the broader and more deep-going will be a workers' democracy. The imperialist rulers understand that should, for example, Venezuela, Central America, and the Caribbean go socialist, Cuba would flourish as an irresistibly attractive workers' democracy, something that the rulers won't permit. Number 10, the international development of capitalism has given the socialist revolution an international character. The Stalinist degeneration of the Soviet state and the Stalinist deformation of the Chinese, Vietnamese, North Korean, Albanian, and other such states is an overwhelming illustration of the falseness of the theory of socialism in one country. 11. Quote, when in the course of development, the class distinctions have disappeared, and all production has been concentrated in the hands of a vast association of the whole nation, public power will lose its political character. Quote. In other words, the state withers away. The opposite is also true. The monstrous growth of state coercion in the USSR, etc., showed those societies were moving away from socialism, not towards it. Number 12, quote, the working men have no fatherland, quote. The violation of this directive of the Second International brought about the devastation of World War I and the subsequent orgies of nationalist carnage, from the Nazi death camps to the bombing of Hiroshima to the many present-day wars of imperial intervention and occupation. Thus, we see that the work of young Marx and Engels continues to give valuable answers to the most important and burning questions of the struggle for emancipation. What other book comes close to the Communist Manifesto in this way? But this does not imply that after 175 years of big economic changes and vast social struggles, the manifesto needs no update. Revolutionary thought has nothing in common with idol worship. Programs and predictions are tested and corrected in light of experience. But corrections and additions to the manifesto can be successfully made only by using the method of the manifesto itself. So here are several important examples. 1. Marx taught that no social system departs from the arena of history before exhausting its creative potentialities. The manifesto criticizes capitalism for retarding the development of the productive forces. Still, the productive forces kept expanding, although with staggering destructiveness. This has changed our epoch into the epoch of wars, revolutions, and fascism. 2. Marx and Engels made an error regarding the timeline. They underestimated the future possibilities latent in capitalism, and on the other hand, they overestimated the revolutionary maturity of the working class. The revolution of 1848, which were anti-monarchical revolutions across Europe, did not turn into a socialist revolution as the manifesto had calculated, but gave to Germany the possibility of becoming a huge capitalist power. The Paris Commune of 1871 proved that the working class, without having an experienced revolutionary party at its head, cannot take power from the bourgeoisie. Meanwhile, the prolonged period of capitalist prosperity that followed led not to the education of the revolutionary vanguard, but rather the bourgeois degeneration of the labor aristocracy, that privileged sector of the working class. The privileged section of workers became, in turn, the chief brake on the proletarian revolution. Given the circumstances, the authors of the manifesto could not possibly have foreseen this dialectic. Thirdly, for the manifesto, capitalism was the kingdom of free competition. While referring to the growing concentration of capital, the manifesto did not draw the necessary conclusion regarding monopoly, which became the dominant capitalist form in our epoch and the most important precondition, the world socialist economy. Only afterwards, in Capital, did Marx establish the tendency towards the transformation of free competition into monopoly. It was Lenin who then gave it a scientific characterization in his book, published in 1916, Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Fourth, the authors of the manifesto pictured too unilaterally the process of liquidation of the intermediate classes, the wholesale proletarianization of crafts, petty trades, and peasantry. In fact, capitalism has ruined the petty bourgeoisie at a much faster rate than it has proletarianized it. Furthermore, the bourgeois state has artificially maintained petty bourgeois strata. Also, the growth of technology and the rationalization of large-scale industry creates chronic unemployment and obstructs the proletarianization of the petty bourgeoisie. Capitalism has accelerated the growth of legions of technicians, administrators, commercial employees, in short, the so-called new middle class. However, the artificial preservation of this strata in no way reduces the social contradictions. It gives them a special malignancy. Together with the permanent army of the unemployed and the lumpen proletariat, the ruined middle class or petty bourgeoisie constitutes the deadliest expression of the decay of capitalism, potential mass base of fascism. Fifthly, the manifesto contains, at the end of chapter 2, 10 demands corresponding to the period of direct transition from capitalism to socialism. In their preface of 1872, Marx and Engels declared these demands to be in part outdated and, in any case, only of secondary importance. The reformists seized upon this to argue that transitional revolutionary demands had forever given way to the social democratic minimum program. This minimum program, as is well known, does not transcend the limits of bourgeois democracy. As a matter of fact, the authors of the manifesto indicated quite precisely the main correction of their transitional program. And what was that correction? It is this, quote, "The working class cannot simply lay hold of the ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes." Quote. In other words, the correction was directed against the worship of bourgeois democracy. Marx later counterposed to the capitalist state the state of the type founded by the Paris Commune. This type later took on the more vivid shape of Soviets, and that's the Russian word for councils of workers, soldiers, and peasants. There cannot be a revolutionary program today without Soviets, councils, and without workers' control. As for the rest, the 10 demands of the manifesto, which appear archaic in an epoch of peaceful parliamentary activity, have today regained completely their true significance. The social democratic minimum program, on the other hand, has become hopelessly antiquated. 6, believing that the German bourgeois revolution will be but a prelude to an immediately following proletarian revolution, those are the words of the manifesto, it cites the much more advanced conditions of European civilization as compared with what existed in England in the 17th century and in France in the 18th century, and the far greater development of the proletariat. But the revolution of 1848 revealed within a few months that precisely under more advanced conditions, the bourgeois class cannot complete the revolution. It cannot fulfill its own aims. The big and middle bourgeoisie is far too closely linked with the landowners and frozen by the fear of the masses. The petty bourgeoisie is far too divided and its top leadership is far too dependent on the big bourgeoisie. As demonstrated by the entire subsequent course of development in Europe and Asia, the bourgeois revolution, taken by itself, cannot be completed. A purge of feudalism is possible only on the condition that the proletariat, freed from the influence of bourgeois parties, can take its stand at the head of the peasantry and establish its revolutionary dictatorship, transform society. By this token, the bourgeois revolution becomes intertwined with the first stage of the socialist revolution. The national revolution becomes a link of the world revolution. The transformation of the economy and of all social relations assumes a permanent, that is, an uninterrupted character. That is what Leon Trotsky meant by the permanent revolution, which I will discuss here in 2 weeks' time. For revolutionary parties in the countries of Asia, Latin America, and Africa, a clear understanding of the organic connection between the democratic revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat, and thereby the international socialist revolution, is a life and death question. 7. While showing how capitalism draws into its vortex the underdeveloped countries, the manifesto contains no reference to the struggle of colonial and neo-colonial countries for independence. Marx and Engels thought social revolution, quote, in the leading civilized countries at least, quote, that means most developed countries, would occur soon and would automatically solve colonial question. The questions of revolutionary strategy in colonial and neo-colonial countries are therefore not addressed by the manifesto. Yet these questions demand an independent solution. So while the idea of the national fatherland has become poisonous in advanced capitalist countries like Germany, Canada, the United States, it remains a relatively progressive factor in oppressed countries, which are compelled to struggle for their independence. Quote, the communists, declares the manifesto, everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. The movement of the oppressed nations is one of the most important and powerful movements against the existing order and therefore calls for the complete, unconditional, and unlimited support on the part of the working class of the oppressed nations. The credit for developing revolutionary strategy for oppressed nationalities belongs primarily to Lenin. But of course, in supporting the movements of the oppressed nations against imperialism, it does not mean that the working class should support the national bourgeoisie, which would be the gravedigger of a revolution that aims to achieve independence from the imperial lords. Eighth point. The most outdated section of the manifesto is the criticism of socialist literature of the early 19th century. This is found in chapter 3. And the definition of the position of communists in relation to various opposition parties. That's in chapter 4. The movements and parties listed in the manifesto were swept away either by the revolution of 1848 or by the ensuing counter-revolution. However, in this section too, the manifesto is perhaps closer to us now than it was to the previous generations. The degeneration of the social democracy and the Stalinist parties at every step engenders monstrous ideological relapses. In search of gimmicks, the prophets in the epic of capitalist decline discover anew doctrines long since buried by scientific socialism, conspiracy theories, monetary reform schemas, utopian cooperative projects. In addition, there are the ultra-left dreamers who imagine it is possible to replace lethal centralized authoritarian power almost overnight with no centralized party or worker state to fill the void. Marx battled those mistaken ideas 175 years ago, and we continue to do so today. For the sake of winning a better future for humanity, we need, above all, political clarity on the tasks of the revolution and the requirements of the revolution. But our priority as socialists is not the battle against misguided tendencies on the left. It is the battle against the bosses and their decrepit system. That's our priority. In the words of the manifesto, quote, the communists have no interests separate and apart from the working class as a whole, close quote. We strive for workers' unity in the struggle against exploitation and oppression. That requires a program and a means of winning mass influence. Concerning program, I recommend that you read a few publications. One is the Transitional Program, written by Leon Trotsky in 1938, the founding document of the Fourth International. I also suggest that you read this one, Prospects for Socialism in Canada. And the Manifesto for a Socialist Canada, which is the document of the NDP Socialist Caucus, which you'll find on its website. Also, Eco-Socialism versus Fossil Capitalism. And the struggle of Indigenous people in Canada against Canadian capitalist oppression and genocide, which is this one. And one more. How can the left unite? All of these booklets and many others draw on positions of the Communist Manifesto, which retains its vivid utility to us 175 years after its initial publication. I also encourage everyone to read every article on the Socialist Action website, because they draw on the same sources, but they're not hidebound and limited to the declarations and analyses of the past, but they build on it. We stand on the shoulders of those who preceded us in the struggles and in theoretical acquisitions. In terms of winning mass influence, there is no substitute for being active in the mass organizations of the working class. In English Canada, that means being active inside the trade unions, and it means being active inside the labor-based New Democratic Party, inside the movements against war and poverty, and involved in campaigns for equality, social justice, and international solidarity. We'll be demonstrating in solidarity with the Palestinian people on April the 15th in Toronto and other places across the country and around the world, and that's just one example. In this period of austerity, environmental collapse, and political repression, there are large openings for radicals and socialists. But simply being inside those movements alone is insufficient and ineffective. To win a majority to revolutionary socialism, the modern version of the Communist Manifesto, it is necessary to work in a disciplined, democratic, and creative political framework with like-minded people. There is such a framework. There is such an organization. It is the sponsor of this webcast. It is the backbone of the Workers' Action Movement. It is at the core of the NDP Socialist Caucus. It was the initiator of the Municipal Socialist Alliance in Ontario and the Vote Socialist Vancouver on the West Coast. It is the host of the International Educational Conference that is scheduled for June the 4th, to which I invite you. It is Socialist Action. And on behalf of Socialist Action, I warmly invite you to join us tonight. And thanks for listening. I look forward to your questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Barry. So now we're going to turn it over to our producer, Barakat, for the first three questions. Barakat?
Yep. Thank you. Thank you, Barry. So I'll read the first three questions, and I will also put them in the chat. So the first question goes as this. What are the political implications of the Communist Manifesto's call for a united front? The text argues that the communists cannot achieve its goals if they are isolated from the working class. The interests of the proletariat, the manifesto says, are our interests. How does this differ from the views of ultra-leftists? How can this view inform our political strategy today? And then the next question goes as, what does the Communist Manifesto reveal about the national question in Canada and other countries? And then the last question asks, did the Communist Manifesto anticipate the rise of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism? What about the potentials for anti-imperial struggles? Was there a theoretical kernel that informed subsequent theories of imperialism, such as those developed by Lenin? Let me quickly, and I just put those questions in the chat as well, so feel free to reread them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Barakat. Okay, Barry, you have 8 minutes.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for the questions. They'll help us delve more fully into the wisdom of the manifesto and subsequent acquisitions of the workers' movement. Well, the political implications of the Communist Manifesto's call for unity, they didn't use the expression United Front. That term was coined by the Communist International in 1922. But the The notion of unity is expressed in the manifesto when it says that the working class strives for its constitution as a political party. That is one unified formation that attempts to achieve the aims of the working class politically, not just through economic minor reforms, but the transformation of society, a new political state to serve the interests of the majority. So in that sense, how could it be achieved when there are so many different views within the working class? Well, this is the ultimate demonstration of the non-sectarian character of the Communist Manifesto and those who follow its political logic. And that is, we need to work together where we can agree. We don't have to agree on everything. We don't have, our interests are not separate and apart from the workers' movement as a whole. The communists, revolutionary Marxists, the socialists are simply the most far-seeing segment, the advance guard, if you will, of the working class, pointing out how the struggle that we wage for immediate gains culminates in the working class forming a government in its own interests and transforming society. So that's the implication of the call for unity. That is the need for the working class to ally in all of its sections to advance its interests, even with respect to partial democratic and defensive demands. The interests of the proletariat are our interests. And this, how does this differ from the ultra-lefts? Well, there are many definitions of ultra-leftism. Some ultra-lefts think that you can transform society simply by going and creating an alternative society separate and apart from the mainstream society, like the hippie communes of the 1960s, for example. And there were others, Charles Fourier, France in the 18th, 19th century, who advanced a similar perspective. There are other forms of ultra-leftism, and that is those who seek to make the change without winning a majority, without trying to win them by substituting themselves for the action of the working class. There was a political activist, Louis Blanc, in France, who argued that the state can be brought down by the actions of a determined minority who use explosives, who wage assassinations, who carry out violent attacks on the apparatus of rule, and that will galvanize the working class behind them, and the transformation can occur on that basis. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, acts of minority violence strengthen the capacity of the state to attack all sections of the working class, not just the perpetrators of minority violence, and to say that they, the state, the bourgeois state, represent the interests of society for peace and justice and respect for the law and things of that kind that you hear from liberals and conservatives to this day. Actions of the ultra-lefts who are impatient and want the revolution to occur, just like mixing hot water and instant coffee. They disarm the working class, they isolate the working class, and they invite repression. We know that revolutionaries are going to be repressed by the defenders of inequality and political and economic inequality, but we don't want to hand them any excuses to attack socialists and the working class as a whole. So we strive to build movements that can bring about change by showing that masses of people support the change. And so we advocate peaceful mass action in every case where it is possible, and that's what the movement against the war in Vietnam succeeded in doing by mobilizing millions of people, brought an end to, along with the heroic struggle of the Vietnamese people, that first and foremost. But the worldwide anti-war movement brought an earlier end to the war in Southeast Asia that would have occurred otherwise. It was a massive worldwide mobilization against the plans of Bush administration to wage war in Iraq that kept Canada out of that war, although Canadian warships did go into the Persian Gulf and later into Afghanistan, but they were stymied by the fact that hundreds of thousands of people mobilized across Canada and millions around the world against that war, which was proven later to have been a complete fraud. The weapons of mass destruction did not exist in Iraq. They existed in Washington and the arsenals of its allies. What does the Communist Manifesto reveal about the national question in Canada and other countries? Well, as I mentioned, the Communist Manifesto actually doesn't say a lot about the politics of national liberation of oppressed nations, but the manifesto does account for the fact that these states, these powerful bastions of wealth and power, incorporated peoples who were there not of their own volition. And that's certainly the case with the Canadian colonial settler state, established by the French and British power, the seizure of land of Indigenous people and the decimation of those people, and which continues to this day. Of course, the struggles for the rights, linguistic, cultural, territorial, economic rights of oppressed nations within the Canadian state as well, including the Quebecois, the Acadians, and some would say the Newfoundlanders as well, who were tricked into confederation and deprived of their resources and continue to be hard done by. So the Canadian state is a prison house of nations, and the manifesto attests to the need for unity and action. And the only way the working class can be sovereign in its own interest as a majority class if it takes up the cause of the oppressed, not just oppressed nations, but women who suffer discrimination and bigotry in society, LGBTQI folks, migrant workers, a whole range of people, many layers who suffer special oppression under late capitalism in the Canadian imperialist state and allied imperialist states. So it's extremely important that we recognize that in order to overcome the class rule of a tiny minority of corporate executives and their hangers-on, working class must champion the struggles of the oppressed, all of the oppressed. It has to eschew the Archie Bunker attitude that I only care about, putting dinner on the plate and a roof overhead. If you don't take up the struggles of all the oppressed, we won't unite and be capable of bringing an end to minority rule in our society. The next question, did the Communist Manifesto anticipate the rise of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism? And what about potentials for anti-imperialist struggle? Well, I think I've addressed that to some extent in the previous question. The manifesto didn't fully anticipate the rise of imperialism. However, Marx and Engels talk in the manifesto, and certainly in their subsequent risings, particularly in Capital, about the tendency towards monopoly. And monopoly capital is one of the main pillars of imperialism. It's the export of capital. It's the establishment of military outposts and aggression against other countries and peoples and states. But it's also, firmly entrenched in the idea of, the big fish eat the little fish, and they become bigger fish, and they become monopolies that control vast sections of the world economy. And increasingly nowadays, we talk about a world economy. Globalization was not fully anticipated by the Communist Manifesto, but the trend towards monopoly capitalism, which accentuates the crises of capitalism, the ups and downs of the business cycle, which leave working people without employment, without housing, without sustenance, especially in the less developed countries. These tragedies are a product of monopoly capitalism. And war is a product of monopoly capitalism. And when the giant monopoly capitalist states have finished for a time dividing up the wealth and resources of the world, and they approach crisis, the next step is they try to redivide the resources of the world by waging war on one another. That's what we're seeing in Eastern Europe, an inter-imperialist rivalry between NATO, which is clearly the aggressor, and Russia, which is, its state power represents a moneyed billionaire class that wants to expand its resources. But in this case, they're fighting against NATO extending its tentacles across Eastern Europe. It has its eyes on Russian resources, and Russian Kremlin have their eyes on the resources west, south, and east. So socialists don't support either side, just as we didn't support either side in World War I. And we recognize that this kind of war between the rich rulers of one state versus the rich rulers of another state is rooted in monopoly capitalism, which the manifesto talked about very directly. The potential for anti-imperialist struggles, of course, it's great potential. It's astounding. It is a leitmotif of world politics today. And so it doesn't really need much more illustration than just to look at Latin America. The struggles of the peoples of Central America, the Caribbean, and Latin America as a whole, South America as a whole, illustrate that no popular leftist government, much less a revolutionary government like that in Cuba, comes to power without facing the antagonism of the empire and its allies. Multiple attempts to overthrow elected governments that enjoy the support of the oppressed and poor majority is a constant. And so the potential for anti-imperialist struggles resides in the willingness and the unavoidability of poor and oppressed people standing up against their exploitation and oppression. But it also requires recognition of the validity of their struggles and the need for those in the North to support the struggles of the oppressed in the South. If we don't, then we fall victim to our own ruling class propaganda that says they need more money for NATO, for armaments, for Canada's involvement in the so-called Lima group, which sought to overthrow the elected government of Venezuela, support for the blockade of Cuba, which the U.S. has brutally carried out for over 60 years. Recognition of anti-imperialist struggles by the workers' movement in the North and support for those struggles, Cuba, Venezuela, Palestine, is critical to the emancipation of the workers themselves. And what did Marx and Engels say about this over 150 years ago? They said in relation to Britain, in relation to England, they said the workers of Britain will never be free so long as they oppress the Irish. And that's a lesson that applies around the world, wherever there is, neo-colonial domination. It's the obligation of the workers of the world to unite, and to unite on the basis of opposition to national oppression. That's a very important theoretical kernel.
Okay, thank you, Barry. Okay, we're going to go back to Barakat for 3 more questions.
Thank you, Barry. So we have 3 more questions. First question goes, the manifesto predicts the revolution in advanced capitalist countries rather than colonies or less developed nations that have not transitioned fully to a capitalist mode of production. How does this impact our understanding of social movements and uprisings in colonized or post-colonial societies? And what can we learn from the manifesto in this regard? Second question goes, could you go into the history of Black struggle in the USA, since they are the most advanced sector of the US? This question comes from Judy. And then the final question from Flock. In what ways do you think the manifesto should be modernized in accordance with Marxist principles? So I posted these questions in the chat as well.
Yeah, I see them, and thank you very much.
Thank you,
Sorry.
Barakat. You have up to 8 minutes, Barry.
Okay. Well, the manifesto relied on its understanding that the development of capitalism, the overthrow of the feudal system, would generate an industrial transformation of society, and that this would create a larger and larger working class, and this would occur in the countries that were first to industrialize. And for that reason, the manifesto says almost nothing about the anti-colonial struggles. The assumption was, and I made this point in my presentation, that the revolution in Europe and America would solve the colonial question, but that did not occur. Increasingly, the imperial lords were able to enlarge their wealth by exploiting doubly oppressed, triply oppressed labor, exploited labor in the less developed countries. And of course, capitalism came into the world covered with blood and sores, and that, of course, it refers to slavery. The slave system, the slave trade, built up the resources of landlords and the industrial capitalists to an unimagined height, unimagined in its time. You know, what was the basis for imperialism in later generations. So the idea that the colonial question can be solved simply by revolution in the advanced countries is mistaken. And the idea that the colonial revolution will occur without the intervention of revolutionary socialists in the less developed countries is equally unfounded. What is necessary is to see that capitalism is a world system. The economy is increasingly integrated, where there's an interruption in the flow of energy, for example. It affects countries far removed from the locus of that reduction in energy flows. And of course, there's the environmental crisis. The environment is being ruined by the pouring of tons and tons of carbon into the upper atmosphere, which is, of course, increasing temperature rise, the melt of the polar ice caps, changing in the movement of air masses, which are playing havoc with weather patterns. And this is a product of capitalism, the uncontrolled exploitation of natural resources without any regard to the impact on humanity and nature on which we rely for life on this planet. So the capitalist system has reached every corner of the world. This was not the case in the time of Marx and Engels, and not even the case, 75 or 80 years ago. But now every part of the world has been drawn into the vortex of capitalist mode of production. And so it's incumbent on those who would end the climate crisis and who would end the torment of the starving masses who are forced to flee wars and ecological catastrophe. It's incumbent on those who would liberate the working class in the advanced countries and everywhere else to take on board the fact that there will not be a perfect development, a complete development of industrialization in a world where the North exploits the South, put it in broad terms. The even and rational development of the economy to meet the interests of all is possible only when the system of exploitation and oppression is overthrown. And that requires an integration, a certain integration of struggles that occur at North and South. And just as the Revolutionary Party is important for winning the masses in each individual country for socialist transformation, it is equally important, maybe even more important ultimately, that the workers build a worldwide revolutionary socialist party to integrate the struggles around the globe, to instill international solidarity, strike support, boycotts, aid to the workers who are fighting repression. That is extremely, extremely important. And that's why Marx and Engels and their associates formed the International Working Men's Association, the first international. It lasted only a dozen or so years. Big fights between the Marxist wing and the anarchist wing limited the capacity of that organization to flourish. But a second international was formed. Unfortunately, it succumbed to parliamentarism. Third international arose on the aftermath of the victory of the Russian Revolution. And the fourth international was formed following the Stalinist degeneration of the latter. This is why socialists continue to see as critically important, as indispensable to the achievement of the goals of global equality and a mode of production in harmony with nature, to constitute and to build a revolutionary international movement, an international party. And that's enshrined in the words of the International, which is sung on May Day. The day will come when the international working class is the ruling class, and the international party will be critical to its victory. The struggle of the Black people, the Black liberation struggles in the USA, since they're the most advanced sector of the US. Well, most politically advanced, most aware because of the oppression that Black people experience. And, its leaders, like Malcolm X, were assassinated by the state and its agents because they stood up forthrightly and said, we must struggle by any means necessary. By any means necessary, said Malcolm. And we socialists support that perspective, that cannot rely on the state, on reform of the existing system, but it is important to challenge the rulers through peaceful mass action. And if push comes to shove, by other forms of action in which the working class will demonstrate its capacity to defend itself against racist cops and imperialist soldiers. The Black struggle in the USA reached a peak in the 60s and 70s, but then, like the feminist movement and the environmental movement, were co-opted into the Democratic Party, that it became just a wing of the Democrats who utilized them as cannon fodder for the electoral wars that they waged against the other main party of capital. What's needed, and there was only the first glimpse of this in the 70s and in the United States, is an independent Black political party that would ally with progressive and revolutionary sections of the labor movement to form a labor party. An independent Black party would be independent of the Democrats and would be independent of the Greens and other pretenders to emancipation, and would be at the front of movements against war, movements against attacks on democratic rights, movements against all efforts to stymie liberation movements around the world, movements that would organize the unorganized. The majority of young workers who are unionizing in the United States today, and we've seen a growth in unionization efforts and even of strikes in places, like Amazon. The majority are Black, young Black men and women, and LGBTQI folks as well, who are not surprisingly at the forefront because of their daily experience of brutality, discrimination, super exploitation. So that's, I guess, a lesson of the Communist Manifesto, in that an injury to one is an injury to all, and the need for workers' unity is underscored by every page in that manifesto. In what ways do I think the manifesto should be modernized in accordance with Marxist principles? Well, I've touched on these already. First of all, to take into account the national question and the absolutely central role of the anti-colonial struggle, or the anti-neo-colonial struggle, and the importance of the working class leading the struggle in alliance with the poor farmers in the less developed countries, and the importance of solidarity with struggles for emancipation and against national oppression in the North for those waging it in the South. That's absolutely critical, and that should be emphasized. There's another section of the world proletariat that bears a lot of attention, and that is the struggle against the bureaucratic deformation of workers' revolutions, the struggle against Stalinism, the struggle against the idea of socialism in one country, the abandonment by the Stalinist rulers of those who've waged struggles for national liberation, who were cold-heartedly, as they say, thrown under the bus. I'm going to give you an example, one example, the Palestinian struggle. You know, Israel is a colonial settler state. It's an apartheid state. Recent atrocities against the Palestinian people in Hawara and in the West Bank, south of Nablus, it's just a recent example. Israeli soldiers going into the Al-Aqsa Mosque at the beginning of Ramadan and firing noise grenades and beating the people who were in there praying is just the latest example that occurred yesterday. How did the state of Israel come into existence? Well, the great powers realized that there's a lot of oil wealth in the Middle East, and they needed a loyal partner. And the Zionist movement, supposedly finding a refuge for the victims of Nazism, sought to establish an exclusivist state, not simply to live and be with their Arab and Palestinian neighbors and fight for a democratic society to be enjoyed by all, but a state in which the Jewish settlers boycotted Arab labor, built up an army, drove people away from their homes, intimidation and violence, massacres such as at Deir Yassin in the 1940s, and war after war after war, expanding the boundaries of the apartheid state. But how was Israel established in terms of world diplomacy? Well, there was a vote at the United Nations in 1947. And in that vote, majority voted to establish the state of Israel, to recognize it, to take over from the British mandate and to establish a Zionist state. Majority of states voted for it, but it was absolutely scandalous that the Soviet Union voted for that partition and the establishment of a state of Israel on an apartheid basis. And why did the Soviet Union vote for that? How did that fit into the Stalinist conception? Well, the Stalinists had a party that was active among the Jewish masses in the new state, in the region, formerly Palestine, then renamed Israel. And they thought that this party would be elected to government, or would at least form part of a coalition. And so they saw the route to, political influence in a capitalist state as taking priority over opposing the emergence of a colonial settler state and apartheid state at the expense of the Palestinian people. This is one of the great crimes of Stalinism against the colonial revolution, against the colonial masses, the Palestinian people, first and foremost. And so we need to update the Communist Manifesto, and there is such a document, I'll come to this, to take into account the heavy price the working class pays when its revolutions degenerate and a privileged bureaucracy comes to the forefront and carries out reactionary politics at home and abroad, selling out the interests of the working class, as the Soviet Union did in relation to the Spanish Civil War, and later in Chile in 1973. Many examples. Indonesia, 1965, can be given. So a chapter on how to fight bureaucratic degeneration of a revolution and to reaffirm and strengthen proletarian democracy is absolutely critical to an update of the manifesto. Also, sexual liberation, the liberation of women, LGBTQI people, and trans people. All experience bigotry and oppression in present-day capitalist society. That's not addressed in the Communist Manifesto. Clearly, it should be. And the document that is the best update, at least up until 1938, of the Communist Manifesto that preceded it by 3 generations, is the transitional program, the death agony of capitalism. And the struggle for socialist transformation. That's the founding document of the Fourth International. It was authored by Leon Trotsky and is available today. Everyone should read it. And we need more updates because the world continues to change, even though it doesn't change fundamentally. It changes in some important respects. And if we don't constantly update our analysis and our tactics and our programmatic positions, we will not be able to provide the leadership required to wage the struggle to victory.
Thank you, Barry. Back to our producer, Baraka, for 3 questions.
Thank you, Barry. So I have 3 more questions. First question asks, what did the manifesto say about the liberation of women? I think you covered this a little bit. Second question is, given the situation in France where a non-popular reform is being passed without the consent of people, how should we effectively organize and fight against these bourgeois governments? And the last question is, how do you view the function, role, significance of the manifesto in the context of when it was written compared to other great communist theoretical works?
Okay, so yes, you have 3 questions. I think that is the last of our questions. So you have up to 12 minutes to answer the questions and make any closing remarks that you would like to make.
Right. Okay, thanks for those. As I just said, the Communist Manifesto doesn't say very much about the liberation of women. And in fact, it uses some pretty dated terminology referring to workmen having such and such interests and such capacity to change the world. There were women activists in the First International and certainly in the Second International. Clara Zetkin, Rosa Luxemburg, in the Russian Revolution. Kollontai was Minister of Education in the workers' government. But at the time of Marx and Engels, they talk about how women are regarded by the bourgeoisie as the common property of society, that they're there for a childbearing function. They should work, in the nursery, in the kitchen, but of course women worked on the looms. They were making the textiles. They were doing the drudgery of the Industrial Revolution, generating profits. And they tried to unionize, and they met with repression, and they launched International Women's Day in the early years of the 20th century. But apart from decrying the subordinate position of women, how they were regarded as property by the bourgeoisie, and even the wives of workers were regarded as property of the bourgeoisie because it was about the reproduction of labor, and that they must overcome that. And the Communist Manifesto, of course, identified with their struggle for equality, but it didn't denote a particular movement. It didn't denote the need that we understand in the modern movement for parity in speakers, in platforms, in election teams, the need for an autonomous women's movement that women's liberation will continue after the revolution, or the revolution will not succeed. Women's liberation through socialism. Without socialism, there can be no women's liberation. And without women's liberation, there can be no socialism. That's informed by our experiences of the first wave of feminism around the suffrage, the right to vote, in the early years of the 20th century, and the second and third waves of feminism in the 60s, 70s, and beyond. That's something that we have to develop. The Communist Manifesto is a document for human liberation, but it doesn't specify a lot of this particular critical interconnections between the various oppressed and the working class as a whole, which strives to transform the system and can do so only by championing the demands of all of the oppressive states. So that is implied by the manifesto, which decries, the horrid conditions of exploitation that existed in its time, and that speaks to us across the 175 years since. The situation in France. I'm glad someone asked this question. The unpopular reform is, of course, raising the attempt by the Macron government to raise the age of retirement to 64. It was 60, then it was raised to 62, and there was a promise from his predecessors that there would be no further raise, but now they're attempting again to raise the age of retirement. Pensions were first instituted, the age of retirement first contemplated in Germany by Bismarck. And it was proposed that the age of 65 would be the age of retirement. Was that something so generous in the late 19th century? To the contrary, most workers died in their 50s and 60s. They didn't survive to their late 60s to enjoy any such thing. That's why Bismarck, felt comfortable proposing this social reform. Well, Macron says that the pension fund cannot be sustained if workers retire, quote, early, but capitalism, exacts a heavy toll on workers, especially in highly stressful and physically demanding occupations. Mentally stressful as well as physically demanding occupations, and workers say we work to live, we don't live to work. We want to enjoy what remains of our lives if we survive into our 60s. And the movement in France is a movement against neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is the attempt of the rulers today to make the working class pay for its crises, its repeated crises of overproduction, an irrational capitalist system that spends more on the military than on healthcare. So they've drawn the line in France. I know some young people have said to me, well, why should I care about your pension? I can't even get a job or a good, decent, full-time occupation. I can't. Well, I say, comrades, if we don't stop the austerity drive, if we don't stop neoliberalism, if we don't stop the rulers from being able to make us pay for their crises, then we're not going to be able to get employment for everyone. We're not going to be able to, reduce the drudgery of work, to increase the safety of work and life in this society. We're not going to be able to save the planet from ecological destruction. We need to support the struggles that come to the forefront. And this struggle is at the forefront right now. People in France are mobilizing like we haven't seen since 1968, 69. It is incredible. Millions. And these general strikes, which have occurred approximately every week for the last month, are most inspiring. And they're forcing Macron to think again dynamic of these struggles. And there's a similar struggle, against cutbacks in Germany and in Portugal and in England, in Britain, where the National Health Service is under attack and cuts by the Tories are front and center on the chopping block are the social gains of the past. All of these struggles demonstrate that workers are not simply going to take it, are not going to simply absorb the blows that come our way, because the rulers find that their system is not capable of meeting their security needs and the needs of their system to exploit labor and resources worldwide. So this is the issue. It will be very important that the delegates at the Canadian Labour Congress that meets in Montreal in the second week of May express profound solidarity with the workers' movement in France and with the other movements across Europe that I just mentioned, because their struggle is our struggle. If they win, we will win. And the opposite is also the case. So we need to come behind them. There should be pickets in front of the French consulates and embassy in this country to show that workers here support the struggle of the masses to defend an age of retirement. It shouldn't go to 64, it should go back to 60. And that will provide more jobs if workers retire in good health a little bit earlier and can enjoy the later years of life with their families and friends and their hobbies and whatnot. There'll be jobs available for young people. And that's what would be a benefit, another benefit of this struggle. Yeah, the people have not given consent. In fact, Macron has imposed this revision of the age of retirement through special legislation. And it passed through the French National Assembly by a majority of one vote. It was razor thin. It has united the left, including the reformist left and the more radical left. Our sister party in France is the Nouveau Parti Anticapitaliste, which is playing an important role in these strikes, particularly in the rail and postal sectors. We are with them 100%, and their struggle is a priority, because you have to understand, as the Communist Manifesto did, that the workers of the world must unite, because the world is the economy. The economy is the world, and the working class will win or lose on the basis of its ability not only to conquer power at home, but to defend those who conquer power in their countries, in their regions, in their social movements. So that's extremely important. How do you view the function, role, significance of the manifesto in the context of when it was written and compared to other? Well, that's easy. Why are we discussing the Communist Manifesto? Why is it the most popular text in the world, more popular than the Christian Bible? Why is it read, discussed, debated, considered, and potentially amended again and again in every land? Because of its power, because of its foresight, because of its capacity to analyze, an outmoded system, to explain that the emergence of capitalism from feudalism advanced industrial development, but then soon monopolies imposed a fetter on its further development and subordinated progress to profit, and exacerbated the brutal conditions of life, especially at work. There are many workers who died and are buried, and on the gravestone it says, "Killed by capitalism." This is a moniker, particularly on some of those the miners in Cape Breton, who you see the gravestones with that phrase etched on them in Nova Scotia. So it is amazing that Marx and Engels could write a manifesto 175 years ago that touched on so many points powerfully, with illustration, without exaggeration. They didn't get the timeline because they didn't see the further development of imperialism as a world system. They didn't address women's liberation as it should be today. The colonial question was missing, but the method of the Communist Manifesto is the reason why we are still discussing it, because its method class analysis and the need for class struggle politics. I just want to mention one other thing that didn't come up in questions, and that relates to a section of the Communist Manifesto that's called conservative or bourgeois socialism. And you'll see in a moment why I'm citing it. A part of the bourgeoisie is desirous of redressing social grievances in order to secure the continued existence of bourgeois society. In this section belong economists, philanthropists, humanitarians, improvers of the condition of the working class, organizers of charity, members of societies, temperance fanatics, hole and corner reformers of every imaginable kind. Why do I mention this? Because there's a difference between solidarity and charity. And there are people, even in the left, who will say, instead of fighting for a workers' government, which we may never achieve, let's form a cooperative, or let's buy sleeping bags for people who are living rough. We should demand that the state do that. If the socialist movement becomes dedicated to philanthropy, humanitarian reforms, we will lose our sense of destiny with the transformation of society as a whole. Our role is to care for all of the neglected and oppressed, and to demand that the state provide food, housing, apparel, especially in countries with a cold climate. We have to demand through mass action. We have to mobilize the working class. We have to engage in strikes, and we have to form political parties that will fill the gap in elections, even at the local level. For example, the NDP won't run candidates locally. So we, with allies, formed the Municipal Socialist Alliance and the Vote Socialist Vancouver movement, and got thousands of votes, showing the appetite for change. So we're not going to engage in what the manifesto referred to as conservative or bourgeois socialism. We're for revolutionary working class socialism, and that means building a political movement to fight for change, not to substitute for the state, but to demand action of the state. And when the state cannot fulfill the demands of the masses, to remove that state and replace it with a democratic state representing the interests of the vast majority, a worker state based on a socialist program. And it looks like there's one more question, Chair. Should I?
Yes, I was coming to that. I was waiting for you to finish, and I was going to say, there is one more question that came in late, but I think it's important. So I would like Barry to answer it. I will read it out so people will know what the question is. What can we do about big union bosses sleepwalking with neoliberals instead of leaning with workers to raise class consciousness in communities? So you have 3 minutes, Barry.
Yeah. Well, this is a terrific question and a good way to end the discussion this evening. What can we do about big union bosses sleepwalking with the neoliberals? Well, we need to replace them. That's the short answer. And how to do that? How to do that? Well, some socialists think that if you just shout loud enough from the sidelines, the rank and file will get it and will mend their ways. That's not how it works, my friends. You have to be in the movements that you want to change, that you want to remove their bureaucratic and conservative leaders. You have to be there, and not just on election day, in terms of internal union elections, for example, but every day. You have to be there as a shop steward to file the grievances. You have to be there as someone who pushes the negotiating team, maybe get on the negotiating team, but by advocating transitional demands in the interests of the workers, not only of your shop and your industry, but cross-country and around the world. You have to be in the forefront of international solidarity, which I keep coming back to again and again and again. And guess who's not? Who's not championing those principles? And guess who is even curtailing the democracy of the movement to prevent discussion of those ideas? It's the 6-figure bureaucrats or the 7-figure bureaucrats who lord it over the rank and file and who are elected and reproduce their power and privileges in some of the largest unions. Even in small unions, you have bureaucratic conservatives who come to the fore. Sometimes because workers captured by the bargaining unit in representation are demoralized. They don't see any way of going forward. You know, they weren't born with an understanding of proletarian politics, of class struggle politics. You know, Lenin explained that these ideas of the class struggle, of socialism, come from outside the class. It doesn't mean they're not coming from workers. They're coming from workers who study the history of the workers' movement and who bring these ideas into the class as the advance guard of a revolutionary workers' party. The Workers' Party, the Revolutionary Workers' Party, is the living memory of the class. It is the body of workers who understand what it takes to win, to organize and to fight, and not to be taken in by ultra-leftist self-isolating tactics, but to educate and organize the majority, whether they're fighting for a wage improvement against hyperinflation, or they're demanding better health protection in a pandemic, or you know, standing up for the rights of migrant workers who are brought in and not paid, or paid poorly under horrible conditions, and lowering, you know, the wage rate for everyone because we allow them to be exploited. You know, that's what we need to do, is to present a class struggle perspective. The union bureaucrats, those who are privileged and who want to retain their privilege and will limit union democracy in order to do it, they have to be replaced and removed. And how is that going to happen? Not only by us socialists being there and advancing the demands for collective agreements and for you know, day-to-day improvement of working conditions, health and safety, but you know, by establishing organized caucuses in every union, even in the most democratic unions like the postal workers, or the least democratic unions. I'm not going to name them because there's so many. You know, we need to build an outpost, a chapter of the Workers' Action Movement. The Workers' Action Movement, check it out on its website, workersactionmovement.ca, stands on solidarity, democratic, socialist principles, and it runs candidates. That's how one of our leading members has been elected again and again to the executive board of the Ontario Public Service Employees Union. I was on that body some decades ago, running on a class struggle program. And we have comrades and friends in the Workers' Action Movement and beyond who are in dozens of unions. And there we'll be together at the CLC convention soon, fighting for principles that advance the interests of workers, because the communists have no
30 seconds.
interests separate and apart from the working class as a whole. And we demonstrate that in our work in the unions, which is to democratize the unions, to make them into instruments of class struggle, and to make sure that they can offer the leadership that can enable us to survive and overcome the present austerity crisis and the present environmental crisis. The future depends on it. I hope that you'll support the Workers' Action Movement, whether you're in a union or not, and join Socialist Action as we struggle to bring about a transformation of society in keeping with the principles of the Communist Manifesto of 175 years ago.
Well, thank you very much, Barry, and who is also, by the way, the political producer of this series of webcasts. And thank you to our technical producer, Barakat Gouda in Vancouver. And a very special thanks going out to our listening and watching audience who tuned in tonight, and for those who will tune in on YouTube in the future. So please consider being a supporter of Socialist Action news reports, which we will send to you online. To fill out the form, just visit our website at www.socialistaction.ca. And if you would like to talk to us about joining SA, write to socialistactioncanada@gmail.com, or just call 647-986-1917. This show has been recorded and can be seen on the Socialist Action YouTube channel. The next webcast will be on Thursday, April the 20th, on the topic, what is Trotskyism? And our speaker will be the speaker you've heard tonight, Barry Weisletter. So that is on Thursday, April the 20th, starting at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. The Zoom link will soon be on the SA website. In the meantime, comrades, please be safe, stay healthy, and stay active. Bye for now.
And we're done. Thank you.